Hello, everyone. I'm Augie Napoli, President and CEO of the United Way of Greater Cleveland.
I'm Danielle Sidnor, President of the Cleveland branch of the NAACP. Together, we are honored to present to the community this 10-part series of community conversations on the Cleveland Consent Decree. Each session will focus on an area of the consent decree and police reform through a conversation among experts and community leaders to provide insight and to re-engage the community.
The objective of these conversations is to provide a forum to raise awareness and increase community engagement on the consent decree and how it affects members of our community. United Way's mission is being a voice for those in need. We know that there are so many underlying aspects of poverty which are hard to see and equally hard to discuss and solve. And certainly systemic racism is a main contributor to generational poverty that has afflicted our community for far too long. Not one organization can solve inequity, and I am humbled to be only a small part of a group of esteemed community leaders from whom you will have the privilege to hear in this 10-part series.
For 108 years, the Cleveland branch of the NAACP has worked to improve the political, educational, social, and economic status of minority groups, to eliminate racial prejudice, and to keep the public aware of the adverse effects of racial discrimination, and to take lawful action to secure its elimination. This community conversation and the monthly topics we will address related to the Cleveland Consent Decree are right in line with the work our organization has addressed and championed every day for over a century right here in Cleveland. Through this series, you will hear about the current status of the Cleveland Consent Decree and the future of policing in the city. And as the name of this event suggests, this is a two-way dialogue, and we want to hear from you tonight and every month in this series as we tackle these various topics.
I'd like to thank Cuyahoga Community College and Rockwell Automation for sponsoring and making this series possible. I would also like to thank the City Club of Cleveland for partnering with us in hosting the series of events, and WOVU for simulcasting this evening's discussion live on 95.9 FM. We'd also like to thank all of our community partners. This evening marks the second conversation in our 10-part consent decree series. Tonight's topic, the use of force within the Cleveland Division of Police. The discussion will focus on changes that have recently been made by the Cleveland Division of Police to its force policies. Building on these improvements, the Cleveland Division of Police will revise force policies, training, supervision, and accountability systems so that any use of unreasonable force is promptly identified and responded to appropriately.
Tonight's moderator is Nick Castele. Nick is a journalist and producer for ideastream, covering politics, government, and a variety of other issues in Northeast Ohio. Among other major stories, he's reported on local costs of the opioid crisis, Cleveland's history of never realized transit plans, and a high rise in East Cleveland that stood vacant for years. I am honored to introduce tonight's conversation moderator, Nick Castele.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Thank you to the United Way of Greater Cleveland, as well as the Cleveland branch of the NAACP. Thank you also to the City Club of Cleveland for helping put together this discussion tonight. And most of all, thank you to those of you who are joining us here, tuning into this discussion, whether that is on the radio on 95.9 WOVU, through WOIO's live stream at cleveland19.com, on YouTube, or a variety of other ways online where you may be joining us for this program. We're here tonight to talk about how Cleveland police use force and the structures that have been put in place for holding officers accountable for misusing that force. Since 2015, the Cleveland Division of Police has been operating under a consent decree that mandated wide changes throughout the division. This stemmed from a 2014 U.S. Justice Department investigation that concluded there was, quote, reasonable cause to believe that CDP engages in a pattern or practice of using unreasonable force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. It's been 6 years since that investigation, and we're going to be talking today about what has happened since then. And we're especially going to be hearing from you, our listeners and viewers, to answer your questions about the consent decree. Joining us today for our discussion are Cleveland Police Chief Calvin Williams, Brian Maxey of the team that monitors Cleveland's compliance with the consent decree, Louis Katz, Professor Emeritus of Law at Case Western Reserve University and a member of the Cleveland Community Police Commission, Ward 7 Cleveland City Councilman Basheer Jones, Dr. Ronnie Dunn, who is a professor and the Interim Chief Diversity Officer at Cleveland State University, and also with us is Acting U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio, Bridget Brennan, who is on hand to clarify any points about the consent decree that we may need to do during the course of our discussion. We are, of course, holding this discussion virtually, and we are taking your questions by text message. If you have questions about police use of force that you would like our panelists to address, please text them to us at 216-307-5632. Again, that is 216-307-5632. If you have questions about police use of force, please text that number and we will work them into the conversation a little bit later in the program tonight. Chief Williams, I'd like to start with you. You have been, I know, living this consent decree for the past 6 years now. In your view, how has the consent decree changed the way that the Division of Police thinks about using force? What types of force are appropriate and when it's appropriate to use force when interacting with the public?
Well, thanks, Nick. Great questions to start this out with. I want to start off by thanking the United Way, NAACP here in Cleveland, and of course the City Club and others who have sponsored this event, these series of dialogues with our community. I think the consent decree, as we've stated from the beginning, kind of sets a framework in which the Division of Police, our partners in this, the United States through the U.S. Attorney's Office, Department of Justice, the monitoring team, and community partners have a blueprint on which to reform the Division of Police. The mayor and I have said from the beginning, since 2014 when the investigation started, and throughout this process, that we are 110% on board with making changes needed in the Cleveland Division of Police to make us the best policing agency in this country. And the consent decree sets that framework in place for us to get that done. And I think we're making a lot of great strides in getting that done. Use of force is probably the central feature of the consent decree process itself. I kind of disagree a little bit with that. I think community engagement should be the centerpiece of this consent decree and the settlement agreement, because without strong, cohesive, cooperative community engagement, then none of this other stuff really takes shape and takes hold within the city. But again, we're here to talk about use of force. So as the panel goes on, I'll answer questions about stats related to use of force. Use of force has been going down here in the city of Cleveland since the consent decree was in place, both deadly force and non-deadly force, along with complaints that are related to use of force and things like that. Our injuries to officers have been going down also, as well as injuries to suspects and persons out there that unfortunately the division has to use force on in the course of business. But I can get directly in the stats later on, but generally the consent decree sets that framework. We have a lot of folks involved in staying the course and making sure that there's real reform here in the city of Cleveland, not just checking boxes and getting things done for the sake of saying we got it done. But as we'll talk about the numbers later, the numbers speak for themselves. Use of force is declining here in the city. And I think a majority of the people in the city actually see that.
Yeah, on that point of numbers, Chief, I know you've mentioned, I think a recent report from the monitoring team highlighted the fact that we have seen over the past couple of years numbers declining lower, I think, in 2019 than they were in 2017, which was the first year where officers were fully trained on the new use of force policies. Chief, what do you think is underlining that decline in use of force? Has there been a change on the street in the way that officers think about force?
Well, I think the training is probably the biggest factor in that, along with, what we've talked about since 2015, the culture in this division, the culture in the city, how we conduct ourselves. I think that's probably the central piece. Officers understanding that this is the standard, and then we train to that standard, and we give the officers the tools to make sure they maintain that standard. And as occasionally happens, when officers don't maintain that standard, they're held accountable.
Mm-hmm. Brian Maxey, your role is to oversee how Cleveland follows or does not follow the consent decree. You're a part of the monitoring team, which reports to U.S. District Judge Solomon Oliver, the federal judge who oversees this case in federal court. Do you think at this point that the consent decree has made a substantial difference in how police use force in their day-to-day work?
Yeah, and thank you. Yes, I think it absolutely has. As Chief Williams just described, systemically, we're seeing a drop in the use of force. We are seeing a drop in officer injuries and subject injuries both. And we are seeing that the impact upon the crime rates, although there's always an ebb and flow to those crime rates, there's nothing that we can correlate with the use of force ecosystem that is being put into place. And I use that term because, we can get pretty myopic just looking at use of force. When you look at police activity and you look at how they're engaging with their community, how proactive they are, how many stops they're doing, how many arrests they're doing, their engagement with people in crisis. All of these things go into the analysis of whether the department is making the necessary changes in perspective. But as we look at use of force, definitely there's a decline. And what we're seeing is that, all of those metrics show that the decline in use of force is not impacting police services. The next phase in this, and what we really get more granular, is we are in the midst of doing a use of force review where we've taken a statistically valid sample of use of force cases, and we are reading them, watching the associated video, all evidence associated with it, in order to find out not just whether uses of force have declined, but those that exist, whether those are constitutional and whether other changes need to be made. Ultimately, I think the goal in all of this is that Cleveland, the city and the police department become a learning organization to, as these critical events happen, as they always will in policing, to learn from them, analyze it, and have systemic improvement across the board. And that's the goal.
Earlier today, I was reading through the monitoring team's most recent semi-annual report, which was filed with the court to explain the progress the city has made so far. One line that stood out to me was this one. The consent decree, does not expressly mandate that the Cleveland Division of Police use less force, but that when the division uses force, it is constitutional and lawful. Brian, could you explain that distinction and why the monitoring team wanted to make it?
Yes, because I think there is a tendency to think that success is defined by simple reduction in force. That's just not the case. That you could achieve that by simply not being proactive, responding to 911 calls, and doing nothing else with your police department. That would effectively reduce force overall as a number. What's important is to understand that the use of force is part of the role of policing. It's part of what we ask officers to do. We just ask them to do it thoughtfully and judiciously. So it's not just the number, it's a qualitative assessment. Are they doing it right? Are they de-escalating prior to using force? Do they have the least reliance on the use of force as a tool in engaging with community members, that's really the litmus test here, not just the number.
And when we talk about force, obviously, we're not just talking about officers firing their guns, which, of course, is something that gets a lot of public attention for obvious reasons. We're talking about secondary weapons, things like batons, tasers, chemical spray, as well as physical engagement, using body weight or holds, those kinds of things that you might be using as an officer to get handcuffs on someone who is suspected of a crime. And the police division, maybe we can talk about this later, has different levels of force as well. They're categorized by severity. Councilman Basheer Jones, you've been listening to this discussion a little bit. You've heard this discussion of the idea that we've seen some uses of force declining over the past few years. When you hear from your constituents in Ward 7, what do you hear from them? Do you think that people are really seeing this in their day-to-day lives?
First, thank you so much to United Way. Thank you so much to NAACP for putting on such an important conversation. I chuckle a little bit, not because it's funny, but just this idea, use of force tends to be different when it comes to Black and brown people. There was a use of force. A gun wasn't necessary to what happened to George Floyd. Recently, we just saw the news of a young guy who was, beat up a little bit more than he needed to be, even after with the handcuffs being put on him. So, I'm not sure, as we look at the consent decree and we see the things that have been accomplished, there's a lot of things that we have a far way to go when it comes to training, when it comes to cultural competency, really. I mean, that's the big problem that we're having. So no, my community is still expressing the fact that they're being roughed up a lot more than they deserve to be. And as I said, you don't necessarily have to pull out a gun and use it, but we have to change the idea that when it comes to Black and brown communities, what is this? What does it mean to police? What does it even mean? And what the chief said earlier is very important, that we have to have more conversations about community policing, having better relationships with the people that you are serving, cultural competency, the people that you are dealing with. And even when it comes to our police officers, being from Cleveland is a very important thing. Understanding the people that you are dealing with, understanding the people that you are there to serve. If I'm in the neighborhood of Solon and I see the police, I see neighbors, waving at the police because they understand that the police are there to serve them. But in our community, if the police drive past, unfortunately, not if it's Chief Williams, because he has good, people like him, and I like him as well. But there's other officers that when they drive past, community members don't look at them as being there to protect them. They look at them as people who have the freedom to harm them. So this is what we have to talk about and understand, that the idea of what is being said on paper sometimes does not manifest in the reality of people's lives.
And it sounds like you're connecting this idea, you've mentioned a couple times, this idea of cultural competency, and you're drawing that connection to police use of force. Could you explain that a little bit more? How do you think cultural competency in the police department is a part of that broader picture of looking at how police use force when they are policing communities like the Huff neighborhood?
Thank you, Nick. That's an awesome question, man. Let's take the idea of aggression. If you're not from my community and you're having a conversation with a young Black male, you may think that in his tone that he's being extremely aggressive, and you can become afraid, especially if you've grown up on Fox News and you've grown up on your idea of gangster rap. You've never been around Black people, Black and brown people, then you already have a perception of who you think people are. And then now you're being thrown into these neighborhoods, So then when a young man speaks to you, if you're from that neighborhood, you will understand, oh, that's him. Just don't listen. I'm gonna talk to your mother about what you just said, man. You're gonna have a better understanding of how people respond. But if you're not from there, any slight move is considered to be an act of aggression. And how many people have died as a result of that? So you have to understand, as CPD, and I'm hoping with this consent decree, it talks about the training. We have to really have some serious dialogue about training. And you're going into these communities, understanding the people. And guess what? This is not just an issue with police. It's an issue with teachers. It's an issue, right? When you look at high schools and educational institutions, Black boys are the most suspended group than any other demographic. It boils down to understanding the people that you are working with. If you don't understand them, then any act is considered an act of aggression.
Chief Williams, I'd like to ask if you might be able to respond to that, because I know you mentioned earlier that you think that community engagement is really the core of the consent decree. It sounds like what Councilman Jones is saying here is that this idea of cultural competency, understanding the communities you serve, is also a big part of the situations that might result in officers using force. I mean, do you agree that cultural competency is sort of a part of this discussion about using force and de-escalation too?
Oh, absolutely. And the councilman and I have had conversations about this in the past. We've had conversations specifically about the officers that police the 3rd District, which encompasses Ward 7, and the great job that they do out there. There are a lot of great officers in our division. I'm not going to say 100%, but a great percentage of the officers come to work every day to do a good job. I'd say a great job for the people of the city. And, I just don't want us to lose sight of that fact that a lot of people do that day in and day out. But to your point, there is a component in our cadet classes called a reverse ride along, where we actually take the cadets out into the community and have them see exactly what goes on into the neighborhoods that they're going to police soon after they graduate the academy. Our academy classes, probably over the last 2.5, 3 years, have been probably the most diverse classes that we've had in the last 20 years. And that in and of itself spreads that message of diversity, that spreads those conversations and dialogues between cadets themselves, some from Cleveland, some not from Cleveland. So there are a lot of components that make up that cultural competency part of it. And, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We hope to partner with places like Case Western and Cleveland State and some other places for actual cultural diversity training. We've had it before within the division. We haven't had it in the last few years, but we want to bring that component back. But I think the most important part is to actually have our officers get out there in the community face to face and meet and talk to people. And to the councilman's point, not everybody out there is a threat just because they're loud and boisterous and things like that. And I think for the most part, officers understand that, it's not just what they see on TV. It's not just, how they grew up, but they do understand that in urban culture, be it Black, white, Hispanic, or whatever, is a lot different than maybe a suburban or rural culture. They understand.
I think the chief is being very nice in what he's saying. Let's just be clear that we live in a city that's majority African American. And believe me, there's a lot of great officers. One of my favorite Commander Todd, she is awesome, man. I mean, I absolutely love her. But let's be clear, we live in a majority African American city, and 60% of our police department are white men, right? So I think that it's kind of, I'm sure there are some who understand the culture. And listen, and they're an amazing group of officers. Okay, so I'm not trying, but I just want to state the facts of that everyone does not understand this community. They don't. I mean, and there's people that look just like me that don't understand the community. So that's not the point that I'm making. But what I am saying is that we have to take this idea of cultural competency very, very seriously. And because the chief said that people, everybody doesn't make mistakes, but guess what? One mistake it becomes critical. One mistake can be the loss of a life. And we've seen that over and over again. We see it with Desmond Franklin. We see it with Tamir Rice. And the issue is not just the murder of people from this community, but it seems to be a system that allows officers to get away with it. That is the most problem, that it seems like there is a system that allows officers to apply their biases and get away with it. And that's what causes the most trauma to this community.
I want to get back to a number of those points that we've just discussed here in a little bit. I'm told that we have lots of listener and viewer questions coming in. Dr. Ronnie Dunn, I wanted to turn to you before we go to some audience questions and ask, in your view, how will we know when the consent decree is really working? What would you define as a successful reform, particularly to the way that police use force and the way the division handles officers using or misusing force?
First, let me thank the United Way and NAACP and the other sponsors for hosting this important dialogue. And thank you for that very important question, Nick. I think it will take time before we truly will know what impact the consent decree has had in the city of Cleveland, as when you look at other jurisdictions that have come under DOJ guidance. I'm heartened to hear that the use of force numbers are trending downward. I hope it's sustained long term. For me, some indicators will be when we see that residents of the African American community, all communities of color, are treated equally and feel that they are being treated fairly and justly. And when we see those numbers of victimization of use of force being decreased across the board for all groups, those are some indicators. And when we see the community willing to engage with the police to help address the real crime problems in the community, this divide that exists, it impacts the communities of color adversely more than any other groups, and they need the police the most. But this distrust, that's the realm within which that real criminal element operates with impunity. So when we can see the decrease of shootings of innocent children losing their lives on the street as a result of the community trusting and working with the community and the police. For me, those are some of the signs. But once again, it's going to be a long-term effect overall. It takes time.
Louis Katz of the Community Police Commission, I have not forgotten about you. I do want to get to you in just a moment. We are going to turn over to some audience questions now, some of which I hope we can put your way. If you are tuning in online or in some other form on the radio or elsewhere, we want to hear from you in this conversation about Cleveland police use of force under the federal consent decree. Please send us your questions. You can text them to 216-307-5632. That's 216-307-5632. Joining us now is Alicia Ellis, who is a small business owner and community activist here in Northeast Ohio. She'll be reading some of these questions and bringing them to the panel for them to answer. Alicia, is there a question you'd like to share with us now?
Yes, thank you, Nick, and also thank you to all of our panelists for joining us this evening. As we speak about the cultural competency, community policing, and the reality of the number of white officers versus the number of Black officers, is there a strategic plan in place to recruit people from minority neighborhoods to the police force?
It sounds like a question for Chief Williams. I know that diversity in recruitment has been something discussed quite a bit over the past few years. Where do things stand now? And how would you answer that listener's question?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a recruitment plan in place for the Division of Police. We've had a plan in place for a while. And as I stated before, over the last 2.5 to 3 years, our classes have been the most diverse that we've had in the prior 20 years. As Dr. Dunn stated, things like this take time. 60% of our division is still Caucasian males, even though we've made great strides in that. But we have a lot of work to do. As far as the cultural competency piece goes, again, I welcome anybody that has a program that they think is valuable and adds value to what the division is already doing, to give me a call and let's take a look at that program. But yes, that piece that gets to officers actually recruiting other officers and our recruitment plan and community members recruiting officers, we do have that in place. But I just want to make one point, and I know we're talking about diversity, and usually that diversity comes in Black and brown folks and things like that. But I just want to make the distinction that, you know, you cannot have a diverse police division without having folks that aren't of color. Because there are some great Caucasian officers out there that do a heck of a job for us day in and day out. So I don't want us to just discount that. I don't want us to say that we only need, you know, Black and brown folks on this division. We definitely do, but our Caucasian officers do a great job every day for us also.
You know, the chief and I,
Basheer Jones, Cleveland City Councilman from Ward 7. Please go right ahead.
Thank you, Nick. You know, the chief and I always kind of get into these dialogues, and I respect him. And let me be clear. You know, I appreciate the police. When I call them, I want them to come. And if you were to look at the money that I have spent as a councilman, you will see that I have supported programs around mindfulness for police officers and making sure that they because there's a trauma that exists there as well for our officers. So I'm a supporter of the police, and I'm also a supporter of the community. And more importantly, I'm a supporter of justice. And we don't have to say we don't have to say that we're happy to have good Caucasian officers, because it's clear, because we have 60% of them. So it's clear that we know that already. But we have to understand that there's a historical context when it comes to police and Black and brown communities. There's a historical context. So, you know, there is a quote unquote diversity plan, but, you know, we have to understand that, of course, Black people do not want in whole want to become officers because of what they have experienced and because of the struggle of becoming an officer, and then what is the perception of officers in the Black community. So it's not looked at as being such an amazing job because of how police have treated Black people historically. And not only that, but you also have a lot of people who want to become police officers, but it seems as if the system is not made for them to be successful there. And then once they get in, if they struggle and then they make it, not only are they dealing with the perception from their from the community, but then they also have the struggle of being a minority within the police department and dealing with the structural racism that's within there. So, you know, this is what's, we not only have to recruit, but we have to make sure that there's a system that's there that is welcoming to Black and brown officers. And that has to do with testing, right? That has to do with many different factors that the chief and I have talked about and we'll continue to work on to try to make sure that these Black officers and Black and brown, and not just Black and brown, let's be clear. We're talking about we need more white women, we need more Hispanic women, we need more Arab men and women. We need more diversity in general. We need to make sure that there's a system in place that not only brings them in, but keeps them.
And speaking of historical context and consent decrees, of course, the push to diversify the Cleveland Division of Police, particularly in hiring Black officers, in many ways began in the 1970s with litigation and court orders trying to ensure that there was more integration in the police force. Alicia, I wonder if we could go to another question, one I'm hoping to give to Louis Katz from the Community Police Commission so he can be a part of this discussion.
Awesome. Yeah. So as Chief mentioned earlier about getting into the numbers specifically, we have a couple questions I'm just going to merge here together.
Sure.
Why has the CPD refused to release even a single use of force report despite dozens of public reports requests filed between September and now by the Cleveland scene? And how can the department tell the public it is committed to accountability when it requires a lawsuit to get these records? So just jumping into more of the data here, I want to open that up as well to the panel.
Well, you know, that does sound like a question for the chief. Briefly, Chief, is there something you'd like to, would you be able to respond to that about data requests for use of force?
Yeah,
reports?
Nick, I'll answer it real quick. We have not refused to answer those requests for data. We had that same question on the last panel, and that request had already been filled for their organization. The one you're talking about now for the Scene magazine, there are a lot of things that go on the data request. Sometimes people ask for everything in the kitchen sink, which we may not have at the time. So those requests have to be sent back, have to be fine-tuned, and then come back to the city's process of answering public records requests.
Mm-hmm. Louis Katz, I wonder if I could just throw a quick question to you before we go back to some questions from the community. You've been listening to this conversation so far. Is there something really important that you think the Division of Police needs to hear from the community and the Community Police Commission when it comes to officer use of force?
Well, I think, first of all, the Cleveland Community Police Commission represents the commission. And in that respect, we look upon part of our role as oversight. We work with the division in helping them to change the policies. And I think some of those policies have been really improved over the last 5 years. But I think this whole discussion really has a historical context in which police, and basically white police, were used to keep Black and brown people under control and in submission. And this division was forced 50 years ago to start hiring minority police officers, and they were dragged into the 20th century much against their wishes. I don't think we've made enough progress under the consent decree in the first 5 years. I think we need to consider more about not only use of force, but how police officers treat young Black and brown people on the street, whether they talk to them as they would white people in the same context, whether they talk to them and use derogatory terms when they encounter them. And such conduct, of course, leads to suspicion on the part of Black and brown youths, as rightfully it should. We've got a long way to go, and we've spent millions and millions of dollars through the consent decree and through settlements of lawsuits for bad policing. We're not nearly where we need to be with use of force, de-escalation. If I may go on one more minute, I think that people expect the police to obey the law. If a civilian commits a crime, he's arrested on the spot and taken and charged with a crime. Just on TV the other night, there was a police officer dragging a kid out of a garbage can by his hair. Why wasn't that officer arrested and charged with assault? Similarly,
and I believe in that case, you're not speaking about the Cleveland Division of Police. This was another police force elsewhere in the country.
No, I believe it was Cleveland Division.
Cleveland Police, okay.
And secondly, I'd like to just ask why, when an off-duty police officer shot a gun from his car and killed an African-American motorist, why that officer wasn't arrested on the scene. You would arrest a civilian. He was off duty. He was not in uniform. Why wasn't he arrested?
If I could respond to that question.
Sure, Chief, if you wouldn't mind, Chief Williams, the Cleveland Division of Police, and then we will get back to some listener questions.
Yeah, I'll go with the last question or comment first. The officer wasn't arrested because anybody in that situation, and I'm not going to get too deep into it because there's a grand jury convening about that incident itself. If a person is claiming self-defense, and if the evidence on the scene kind of shows that, that person is brought down, questioned, and released until a prosecutorial determination is made in that case. And that's what happened in that case. I don't want to argue the history of this country and policing because the history of policing in this country is the history of our country itself. We all know it was bad as it relates to Black and brown folks. Nobody's arguing that. What I'm saying is that when we instituted this settlement agreement in 2015 to date in 2020, that we have made progress. Have we made enough progress from my standpoint? No. We have a long way to go. I said that in the last panel, that this takes a long time. It takes too long of a time, but we are making progress. And if we're going to go back and litigate things that happened 100 years ago, we're never going to make progress. I acknowledge that. That's the way this country
was last year, Chief. This was last year. This was last year, Chief. This is not something that was 100 years ago. This is issues that we're talking about that happened last year. And when we were at the table, the question was asked, had the consent decree right now, do we need to continue the consent decree? And the answer is yeah, because the progress has not been sufficient. It has not been sufficient, the consent decree.
Councilman, the consent decree is not over yet. That process is not over yet.
If I could interject here.
Briefly, Ronnie Dunn of Cleveland State University.
Just a couple of quick points. For me, if you look back at the DOJ findings investigation report, it was virtually silent on the issue of race. I think race was referenced twice in that report. And for that to be the basis upon which the consent decree was developed, that's problematic in itself. In the city, as Councilman Jones said at the outset, is majority people of color, majority African American. How can you do an investigation on use of force and not even address the issue of race? So that was problematic. The founding documents. I understand, I agree, it's going to take much longer than this 5-year period. But to the Chief's point, history matters. We have to look at the social historical context. I understand we just can't look at this moment in isolation, these current events that we're in as a nation. This has evolved over 400 years, and we have to acknowledge that. You might, and the people on this panel might understand that, Chief, and appreciate it, but everyone does not. That's for sure. Everyone does not have that same understanding and appreciation for our history.
Nick, can I say something?
If you wouldn't mind waiting, I do want to get to some other questions here because we do want to bring in the community into this conversation as well. If you want to join us, you can text your questions. We are discussing the Cleveland Division of Police consent decree, particularly the use of force by police. The number to text is 216-307-5632. Again, that's 216-307-5632. Alicia Ellis, would you mind sharing with us another question from our community?
Yes, absolutely. And we're on the topic of, circumstances and incidents that happen close to home. Tamir Rice is something that continuously hits all of our hearts. What specific police protocol has changed to ensure that tragedies just like that doesn't happen again?
Chief, was there anything in particular from that case, Tamir Rice, that you think led to policy changes within the division?
Yes, I think the biggest or one of the biggest issues of the Tamir Rice tragedy was communication between our communication center and the officers on the road, the officers on the street that responded. I think that was kind of the linchpin in everything that transpired after they got that call. And we have tightened up our communications. We actually have a system in place that ask a ton more questions about the incident while we're actually dispatching officers to that scene, that the call taker has to go through a script of more questions to get more information. And then that information is passed directly to that dispatcher that gives that call out to the cars on the street.
And it sounds like you're referring in that case because the 911 caller outside of Cadell Rec Center in 2014 had said the gun that he believed he saw Tamir Rice with might have been fake, but that element of doubt was not communicated to the officers who responded. Is that what you're referring to there,
Right.
Chief?
And nor was there further communication about the apparent age of Tamir Rice at the time. The caller actually stated it could be a juvenile, he wasn't sure, and that the gun could be fake. That information was not conveyed to the responding officers.
I've seen a lot of hands go up here. Brian Maxey of the Cleveland monitoring team. We haven't heard from you in a little bit. Was there something on this particular point you were hoping to add?
Well, I mean, the question really goes to, what are the protocols that have been put in place that would address situations like that? And without specifically, going into the Tamir Rice tragedy, all of the policies that have been put in place around use of force are designed to increase time, distance, communication, and shielding, to slow down the event, to not rush in assuming you have all the information. And certainly there are those situations where you have a violent individual with access to victims and you need to respond quickly and decisively. But when you have a situation where you have someone that does not have access to victims and you have the ability to slow down the incident, engage more thoughtfully, get more information, and plan your approach, that's what so many of these policies are about. And I think it applies to that situation too.
I'd like to ask about the protocol.
Louis Katz of the Community Police Commission. A question about which protocol in particular?
I think Samaria Rice has the right to know whether the police policy has changed so that when an officer is responding to a radio call with or without full information, that they will pull up far enough away so that the officer doesn't have to claim he fears for his life and shoot the moment they arrive on the scene. Wouldn't the correct protocol have been to have operated from a greater distance until they found out what the true facts were that they were encountering?
And I believe, and we maybe can get to this point in a bit, one element of, I think, the force review board that you look at is, did an officer escalate a situation leading to them deciding to use force, when really, they maybe could have de-escalated. I do want to get to another question from Alicia Ellis before we move on to another part of this discussion. But Alicia, do you have another question from the community?
Yes, when we talk in the context of cultural competency and community policing, what are some examples when you specifically to the chief and maybe even with Basheer, Councilman Basheer Jones, when we talk about community engagement, what specific things are we seeing and hearing when we talk about police community engagement, and what are folks looking for from the community context to be engaged with this type of approach?
Thank you,
Sure, Councilman Basheer Jones, yeah, please go right ahead.
I do want to make something clear, and that is, even though Chief Williams and I, we go back and forth because we both are passionate about wanting to see Cleveland be a better place. So I do want to make that clear, that when there are good officers like Chief Williams, and good elected officials like I strive to be, we both want Cleveland to be better. We may disagree on certain aspects of it, which is fine. It's okay. We don't have to be disagreeable, but we can disagree, which for me, I think that we've been waiting a little bit too long for progress. We've been waiting too long. We have to move forward because people's lives depend on it. One of the things that I enjoy, there's a little basketball league that I'm in where I before COVID, where I would play with police officers. And I'd be kicking their butt too, man. I tell you, man, I'd be kicking their butt, I'm telling you. But, it's times like that where we can get a chance to see that these officers are individuals who have families, who have feelings, and who also want to have this city be a better place. The problem comes when you have a Officer Loman who was not fired even after the murder of Tamir Rice. You have an issue when there's officers, and let's not even get to the issue of the Cleveland Police Union. That is an issue as well. That plays a part in it, right? But the problem is that the community wants to feel that as officers, you feel our pain. When it doesn't seem like you feel our pain, then that's when it feels like we are separate from one another. When one of our family members died, one of our cousins, one of our brothers, one of our sisters, I was talking to a resident just today, Alicia, and he was telling me how he was arrested and falsely accused and spent over 6 years of his life in jail. How many of people who are right now who are in jail, who should not be in jail as a result of being over-criminalized or arrested for the wrong reason by our police officers? Well, we want to feel, Chief, and for every officer out there, we appreciate your service. We really do. And listen, we don't like criminals as much as you don't like. We want you to remove the criminals as much as you want to remove them. But what we don't want is that we're dealing with the criminal next door and then we make a phone call and another criminal comes to our home. What we don't want to deal with is the fact that we go through pain as a community and the individual that committed the pain as a police department, you're protecting him more than you are protecting the community that's hurting. That is where the problem comes. And that's what the police department has to understand. I understand we being political, but you can't take up for Officer Loman who shot and killed that young boy. You can't take up for officers who shot and killed Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams because they thought there was a gunshot when it was really a car backfiring. You can't take up for that. You have to at some point say, we don't like the bad apples as much as you don't like them, and we're going to get rid of them. When you show that care and when you show that love, then you're going to find that the community is going to be more embracing and be more appreciative. But when we see you get on the news, not you, Chief, I'm just saying in general, when we see people get on the news and take up for officers who shot our babies, who shot our mothers, who shot our fathers, or who over-criminalize our cousins, when we see you take up for them, but then we see you taking people who went into churches and massacred them to Burger King, that does something to Black people. That hurts us, and that makes us believe that the police department is not for us.
Well, Councilman, I agree with you. And you and I, again, have had a lot of conversations and we agree on a lot of things. Let me just put a couple things out there. Our officers care about this community. I probably shed tears for people that have died in this community, been victims in this community more than anybody on this panel. I've stood next to veteran homicide detectives on the scene of a homicide of a young person in this community and saw that 20-year veteran cry for that kid that just got killed. So I don't want people to mistake what some members of our division, be it union members or other people, say during times of crisis and have that reflect on all of us, because it's definitely not true. And I agree. There are things that happen across this country and the city that should not happen. I myself, the mayor, our command staff, the folks that are in charge of this division have said time and time again, if an officer does something wrong, we want him out of here. We're going to do our best, first of all, to prosecute him. And if that doesn't work, to get him fired and hopefully get him to the position where he never gets another job in law enforcement. But some of the issues that are coming up, and I'm great they're coming up, are deeper than policing. Again, it gets back to the history of this country and the history of policing are the same, And if we keep focusing, and I know the focus right now is on use of force here in the city of Cleveland with my division, and if we keep that focus there, yeah, we're gonna make a little bit of progress, but we're gonna miss the whole boat on the other things that need to change to make sure that the things we're doing with the consent decree do stick and maintain itself within the city, because there's a whole system around it that also needs to change, and not just the 1,600 members of this division. And we've been fighting that fight. I've been fighting that fight since 2014 when I got in this chair. And I've been asking a lot of folks to come along with me. Don't miss this opportunity to have some real systemic, it's a word that gets thrown around, change. and not just within the police division, within our city, within our country as a whole, because it's a lot deeper than that. The people that need to hold policemen accountable, yeah, I'm one of them, but there are probably 10 other people up the food chain that have that same responsibility, and a lot of them live right in our communities and won't do it. So we need to make sure everybody's held accountable.
On the question of accountability, one thing that the consent decree requires is that every use of force by officers is reported. You have a computer system where officers are reporting the use of force. They are expected to explain why they used the force that they used. What was the situation that led them to use that? And those reports are reviewed by supervisors up the chain of command. If they are serious uses of force, I believe Internal Affairs also looks at those. And ultimately, Chief, you and a group of folks within the police department called the Force Review Board are supposed to look at all of these and see, are there any deficiencies in the way that we are investigating uses of force, in the way that we are holding officers accountable? As you've looked at this system start to come online, officers logging their reports, have you found any systemic issues or deficiencies in the ways that the division polices the police, to excuse the phrase, when it comes to using force?
Yeah, Nick, the Force Review Board, the FRB as we call it, that you speak of, it's a new concept within the division. It's part of the consent decree. We actually had our first meeting this past Monday, and we're going through that process of how we review those cases. The monitoring team and the DOJ are on board with that critique of our first meeting. It took the entire day to go through 6 use of force cases. 6. Took an entire 8 hours. So you can see the depth of which we take seriously the review of these cases. But even prior to that, there's a review system within the division that holds accountability from the investigating supervisor on scene, which is usually a sergeant or a lieutenant, all the way up to my level as chief of police and over to the safety director. And we have held people accountable within that chain, be it the lieutenant, the captain who reviewed that case and sent it through when they should not have, all the way up and down that chain of command. So that process is in place, but the Force Review Board process, I think, strengthens that a lot in the way we make sure that our officers are doing things the right way, that they're held accountable, and that the reporting system does work. Just one thing I want to put out there, our use of force policies are basically in 5 separate policies. There's a reporting policy, there's a de-escalation policy, there's of course a definitions policy that starts it all off. And then there's an intermediate weapons policy along with a general use of force policy. In total, there are over 37 pages to those 5 policies that govern the use of force for our officers. And officers are held accountable for knowing what's involved in all 5 of those policies and how that works throughout the division. And again, for the most part, our officers do what they're supposed to do. And when they don't, they're held accountable. We just fired an officer. I think Dr. Katz brought that case up a little while ago. We fired that officer right before Christmas for excessive force. We got him out of here, plain and simple. He went through the prosecutorial process and they didn't find anything wrong with that, but we fired him. So we are holding officers accountable. We are doing our best to weed out those bad apples, as the councilman states, and to make sure that the good guys that work and ladies day in and day out to keep the city safe are given the opportunity to do that without people looking on them with a bad eye because of what some of those rotten apples have done.
Brian, Maxey, I know, as a part of the monitoring team, you're a part of this conversation too, examining how is the division as a whole, taking a look at itself to decide whether or not, it is holding officers accountable in the right way. Are you satisfied at this point with the progress that the division has made in looking into those issues of disciplining officers, perhaps, if they have violated the new policies that the consent decree has mandated, especially as it relates to use of force?
So, there are many mechanisms in place. You have the supervisory review of use of force that goes up the chain of command. You have the new Force Review Board, which, I sat there for all 8 hours. I was a long day. I watched some genuine struggles to dig in deeply into those cases. And take a hard look at them. And I think it was a great first day. That entity of the Force Review Board really has the ability to drive change at a department. I used the term a learning organization earlier. It's one of those core critical systems of self-analysis that starts really getting a department to revise itself based on its experience and its officers' activities. The entire format of these reforms is you write the policies, you train the officers to the policies, you send them out into the world, they interact, then you measure what they did. And one of the core components of that is coming online with the data systems to support that, so that you really can look at this and what they're doing systemically, and you do it numerically, and then you actually have to read the cases. We are currently in the process of doing that real-time review of use of force cases. We're reading a whole bunch of them, and we have multiple reviewers, and if there's a conflict between the reviewers, it gets escalated. So we've got this comprehensive methodology. And then once we get a little further into the use of force, we then start looking at the OPS cases and then the internal affairs cases. So to answer your question directly, we're still in the process of gathering the sample data and reviewing those cases. So I don't have an answer for you yet. Certainly our report out on the public safety director came out last year, and that's public. And certainly there's a lot of room for improvement that we pointed to there. As long as I'm talking, I just wanted to very briefly touch on a point that Chief Williams made, which is the police department does not exist as an entity in an ether. It exists within a city, and police departments are not in consent decrees. Cities are in consent decrees. So it does need to be a comprehensive effort by the city to move policing forward in Cleveland. And that's what we're here to measure.
Just to clarify the acronyms, you mentioned OPS, that's the Office of Professional Standards. I believe one of their roles is to look into civilian complaints about police and eventually bring them to the Police Review Board. You also mentioned a report on the safety director, that's former safety director Michael McGrath. This was a report that was released last year, which essentially said that he handed down punishments that were too light and didn't have enough rationale for the punishments that he handed down. And he, of course, is no longer in that position. Carrie Howard is the new safety director. Dr. Ronnie Dunn, I wanted to bring this question to you. You had mentioned earlier the idea that the consent decree maybe does not speak to the issue of race. I was looking into, the Division of Police put out a report not too long ago showing a whole lot of data on the police use of force in 2018 and 2019. It's broken down on a very granular level by what types of force are used, the level of severity, in what districts they're used. And it also talks about the race of the subjects of that force. And looking at the demographic data, what we see is that although African Americans are half of Cleveland's population, 75% of the subjects of use of force incidents are Black. Most subjects are male, and a majority are in their 20s or 30s. Do these numbers seem significant to you, Professor Dunn?
Well, they do, but not surprising. That is why I raised the point as to how can you conduct an investigation in a city with these demographics and not focus on race. So they are alarming. We should all be alarmed by them, but once again, I'm not surprised by that. Your earlier question about when will I really feel that we've made significant progress relative to the issue of policing. And really, I think when I can walk in the Justice Center and see diversity that reflects the city, that's when I will feel that we have made significant progress, because that to me would signify we're policing and administering justice in a more equitable and fair and racially unbiased way. So those numbers disturbing. Obviously, we have some significant work to do, but not surprised.
Chief, I did want to ask you, because this was a report that the division produced and put forward for the public to look at. What was your reaction to seeing those numbers showing that a great many of the people who are subjects of police uses of force are African American?
Again, probably along the lines of Dr. Dunn, not surprised. If you look at the crime stats here in the city of Cleveland, approximately 85% of the victims and suspects of homicides are African American. The same thing with shootings in the city. And if our officers are out there in violent crime enforcement in the city, they're going to deal more with that particular population. And Professor hit the nail on the head. Black males that are between the ages of 18 to 30 are that demographic that are involved in 85% of the homicides and the shootings in the city. I mean, do I like the fact that those numbers are out there? Of course not. Of course not. And that's why I say that, having the police department do a better job, the training, the cultural diversity, things like that are great. And I definitely want those things, and I want them in spades here in this division. But we have to do something about our Black and brown folks killing each other every single day in this city. And if we can get a better handle on that, I think a lot of those things that we're talking about here are going to go down. You're right, between 73 and 75% of our use of force against African-American males. And it shouldn't be that way, with 50% or 53% of the population being African-Americans in the city. So I agree. But again, we're missing the boat if we're only looking at it from a police perspective.
But now, Chief,
Councilman Jones, if you wouldn't mind, sure, go right ahead.
Now, Chief, what you're doing is the same thing that you said that we're doing. Now you are saying that if Black people will stop killing each other, then that will change the situation. Without mentioning the fact that we live in a food desert, without mentioning the
Not what I'm saying, Councilman. That's not what I'm saying. That the question was why. One of the reasons why 70-something% of the use of force is against African American males within that demographic is because 85% of those violent crimes that happen in the city are in that demographic. That's just
but crime is
that's not the only reason.
But I know, Chief, but you're doing the same thing that you just said that we're doing by mentioning police, but not mentioning the entire context of the city. It's also a crime that in these places there's major food deserts. It's also a crime of high lead. This is also a crime of the housing instability in our neighborhoods. You can't just mention crime without. Just let me finish, Chief. Let me finish, please. Let me finish, Chief. Let me finish. It's not just. Please don't do that, because that really hurts my heart. Because when you mention Black on Black crime, right, which we don't mention white on white crime, and we don't mention Hispanic on Hispanic crime, and we don't mention Asian on Asian crime, we only mention Black on Black crime. But let's also mention the fact that these neighborhoods have been redlined. Let's also mention the fact that these neighborhoods have high lead. Let's mention the fact that these neighborhoods have been overly criminalized. You understand? Or the fact that we look at these neighborhoods and people who come from these neighborhoods who have been overly criminalized. For example, now we live in a state that marijuana has become legalized. And now our cousins and our family members who went to jail for selling marijuana, now they can't even take part in this multi-billion-dollar industry, right? We are taking part in the process of generational poverty. Now, let me say this to you, Chief, and let me just add this into context. Study just showed that the city of Cleveland, for everybody out there tuned in, who maybe this is not your experience, but it doesn't mean that it's not being experienced. And it doesn't mean that you are not being impacted by it. Study just showed that since November 2014, Cleveland has paid close to $14 million in settlements in regards to police misconduct. So even if it's not your cousin that's been killed or who's been roughed up, you are still paying for it. Cleveland is still paying for police misconduct overall, not just in regards to the money that has to be paid out, but also in the fact that people are leaving our city in droves because they don't feel safe, right? Not only do they not feel safe because of the quote unquote community, right? They also feel unsafe because of those who are meant to police them. Today we were discussing in committee hearings, or budget hearings rather, the fact that look at Tremont. Tremont was a place that was overall considered to be a ghetto, but the city took the time to push investment to this place. But we don't see that same thing that happened on the east side. We don't see that happening. We see it now happening. We appreciate the mayor pushing what's going on in Glenville, but look at what's happening in Ward 1, Harvard Lee, the first Black middle class in the city of Cleveland. Look at what's happening in Collinwood. Look at people are overall leaving Cleveland. And the census is going to show that. And where they moving to? They're moving to Warrensville. They're moving to South Euclid. They're moving to Cleveland Heights. So what the chief said is very important, which is you can't just, respond to this in a vacuum. But what I want to make clear that no one does this. Don't mention that, oh, if Black people stop killing Black people, then, that's going to make the situation better, without mentioning the fact that the government has sanctioned, in many cases, the slow murder of Black people in this country for centuries.
Councilman, if you really listen to my statement, you and I are saying the exact same thing. I said that if that decrease in crime that involved that demographic of African Americans, yes, we would have decreases of use of force within that category. But if we're only,
we're not saying the same thing.
But if we're only concentrating, hold on, if we're only concentrating on that and the policing aspect of that, then we're missing the whole point of what we're talking about. That's what I said.
Okay.
All those things that you just mentioned, food, access to housing, healthcare, I'm talking about all those things. All those things go into how we enforce things in the city. All of that goes into it. And if we keep just talking about police are, enforcing things disproportionately against African Americans, if we're not talking about how do we solve those other things and only talking about how we solve the police part, then we're missing the whole point.
Chief,
I want to thank you both for this. If you wouldn't mind, Councilman Jones, forgive me. I do want to get to some audience and some listener questions so that they can be a part of this conversation too, but I do appreciate the spirit. This was very good to listen to. Alicia Ellis, would you mind helping us transition over here into another section in which we listen to some audience questions?
Definitely. I believe this one is still in the same context of when we mentioned different social determinants of health, acknowledging the tragedy, the cases of Tanisha Anderson, Juan Ortiz, and others. Would it be in your favor, and maybe this is a direct question to you, Chief, in a favor to dedicate a line for the dispatch of an unarmed mental health crisis response team?
That's a great question. We're already in that process. About 3 years ago, we received a grant from the Adams Board, and we actually have civilian co-responders currently in place that respond along with our officers to people in crisis. I've said, again, since day one, a police officer with 40 hours of crisis intervention training is no match. It does not deliver the amount of services needed in that situation compared to a clinician who's been to school for 12 years, 10, 12 years that deal with people day in and day out that are in crisis. So we have been thrust into that position by, again, to Councilman Basheer Jones' point, the systemic things that happen in this country that push poor Black, brown people, people with mental health issues out on the streets, and they have to be dealt with by frontline services, police, fire, and EMS. So we do our best to train our officers up to deal with those situations. But no, there is no comparison to a clinician that has 12 years of schooling and probably practical experience in dealing with the person in that situation to send in a police officer out there. So we have partnered with clinicians, social workers, and others to actually respond to some of those calls so we don't have incidents like Tanisha Anderson repeated in the city. And we've done so over the last 3 or 4 years.
Nick, can I touch on that?
Sure, Councilman Jones, go right ahead. Then we'll get to another question.
When we look at our budget, over $300 and something million go to public safety. Okay, over $300 million. And listen, we want to have a safe city, but the fact is that no matter how much money that we have put, we are policing. We're not policing in the right way, and it has not made our city any safer. So you made a very valid point. And when you had the country crying and speaking out and saying, "Hey, defund the police," we understood. We understood what they were saying. I don't believe that we should defund the police, but I do believe in the reallocation of some services and some funding. You know, in the city of Columbus right now, my Morehouse brother, the city council president, is working on a plan to say, you know what, maybe everyone shouldn't call 911. You know, maybe there should be another number that goes somewhere else that brings the right people. You can't always bring, and listen, and guess what? This also leaves our officers unsafe because they're going into situations that they're not equipped to deal with. So what we have to look at in the city of Cleveland is we need to bring more mental health experts, because listen, we all have some mental health issues. We all have some trauma growing up in this country, right? So we have to bring the Dr. Dunns and others who can come to the table and say, hey, you know, this is the domestic violence issue. It may not need to be a police officer. This man right here may not need to go to jail, and his children, you know, what type of trauma happens with children who watch their father gets taken away, right? So we have to send the right people to address these issues. So whoever asked that question is a great question. We're working on that within City Council to come up with some legislation to figure out how we can change this. Right now, we're also working on some other things when it regards to policing. So the chief and I, we're on the same page in the majority of things. We want this city to be a better place. We all want it. We want our officers to be safe and to be able to get home to their families. And guess what? We want our community members to be able to get home back to their families. And I think that if we can build that bridge and that understanding, then we're going to be successful.
Thank you very much for that discussion. Alicia, would you mind bringing in another question to us here?
Yes, in the lines of the decree, specifically this question is for Louis. Your statement earlier about the policy is better, but implementation is slow. Do you mind going in a little bit deeper on what you meant by that statement?
Thank you. I would like to go farther with this. I think that the focus in the first 5 years has been on changing policies and developing training. I think we're now about to head into the implementation testing. I think a good police department in this community is going to have to come from internally. I think there's going to have to be a willingness on the part of the police department division to listen to the community, to talk to the community, to share information. Transparency remains a problem. We fight, the chief and I fight over every 2 issues that we ask for data about. He'll give one and he won't give the other. I think that the department that has to get into the minds of its officers to recognize that Black and brown young men are to be treated exactly the same way as white youngsters are. You can't change the city until we make that change. And how a police officer approaches a young person between the ages of 14 and 26 often depends upon the race of that individual and the manner in which the officer speaks to that person determines how that incident is going to either escalate or de-escalate and ultimately end. And we're nowhere near that point yet.
You know, it is one thing that we have not discussed tonight, but is a part of the city's use of force policy, or your set of use of force policies, Chief, is this idea of de-escalation, trying to get officers to, lower the temperature and turn down the heat of an interaction so that it does not lead to weapons being fired at the most severe. Would you be able to give us a quick explanation here of what does de-escalation mean to you? What do you want to see from your officers out on the street when they are encountering situations that might go awry?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nick. And Brian Maxey hit on it a little bit earlier in his explanation about force and reductions of force. De-escalation is just that: time, distance, and tactics. Time, allowing more time to deal with the situation itself, not rushing in and taking police action right away, but allowing more time to deal with that situation. Distance, not being too close to folks so that you either feel threatened or are physically threatened to the point where you have to react in a way that you have to use force. And then it also goes to tactics, the tactics we use, the way we talk to folks, bringing additional officers for officer presence, just to show people, that, there are additional things that we can bring to this to resolve it. We don't want to do that. When we started this process prior to the new policy being trained on and going into effect in 2018, we made it a mandate for officers to take more time on a situation than we did in the past. So in 15, 16, and 17, we actually did that. And that's when our uses of force actually started to go down before the new use of force policy even came into effect in 2018. Actually, in 18, it actually went up because we started to count pointing of a firearm at a person as a use of force, as a reportable use of force. Prior to that, we didn't have that. But in those years, 15, 16, and 17, our use of force continuously went down because we mandated that our officers take more time. We didn't have the official title of de-escalation, but more time to talk through situations, give people additional space, things like that, so we did not have to use force. And prior to that, there was a mentality around our division and probably around the country too, that, time between calls for service, get to this call, answer that call, get to the next call, to reduce our response times, reduce the response times, get there quick, get it over with, get to the next call. In 15, we did away with that. We still count response times, but we tell our officers, take as much time on that assignment as you need to adequately take care of the issues that are at that assignment. And again, look at the numbers, 15, 16, and 17, our uses of force started to go down.
And I might just mention briefly before we get to maybe one more question, that issue of time and dealing with very difficult situations. According to the division's own data, the number one call for service that leads to a use of force are domestic violence calls, which seem like they could be very difficult situations where there's a potential for things to go very wrong. I do, Alicia, want to get to probably another question here. I know that we are running short on time. Is there another question here that you could maybe deliver us here that would bring us home?
Yeah, specifically, I believe this is probably a question for everyone, but specifically for Dr. Dunn. In a sense of your research and expertise, why do you believe African Americans in the city of Cleveland specifically may be uninterested and refuse to become police officers?
Well, that's a very good and important question, and really it's due to the very factors we've been discussing this evening on this panel. The history of that relationship, the current status of that relationship. Ironically, I was in a police training today, training a local municipality on cultural competency training. So Chief, we definitely would like to talk with you and engage with you in that regard. And needless to say, we had that discussion about why more African American and people of color aren't going into policing. And it's due to the contentious adversarial relationship that exists. As Councilman Jones stated, they see what has happened to their family members, if not themselves, within their community. And Chief raises a very good point. It's not just the police, though. The police are just the tip of the iceberg, or the beginning of that criminal justice continuum. So we do need to look at and address those inequities throughout. So in short, that is the reason why African Americans in particular do not want to go into policing. When I was a youngster, if you came into my classroom, my elementary school classroom, and asked the boys in the class what they wanted to be, I guarantee you at least 50% would say a police officer. Today, you go into the same type of classroom, you will not get that response from African American and less so maybe, but Hispanic males as well. So we have
And
to.
that's why,
Nick, if I could real quick.
Sure, Chief Williams,
and-
yes, please.
And I get I get Dr. Dunn's point, and he's correct in a lot of aspects of his point. But I don't want us to continue to taint our recruitment pool by saying majority of African Americans don't want to be police officers. I've been a police officer for almost 35 years, going on 36 years. And again, I have to keep stating it. For the last 2.5, close to 3 years, our cadet classes have been the most diverse ever, even upwards of 45 to 55% minority. And that's due to the efforts of our recruitment folks, in spite of a lot of things that are happening around the country and even the things that have happened in the city. We're having success in recruiting diversity within the division. Now we have to work on keeping that diversity and increasing that diversity, to Councilman Basheer Jones's point. But I don't want people to get the kind of the feeling that, you know, if I'm Black and brown or Asian or, you know, Hispanic in this community, that I shouldn't be a police officer. It is totally the opposite. It's totally the opposite.
Message, if that's the inference that was taken from that. But we know that it is a challenge, and whatever it is that the department is doing, you need to market that more broadly. Because
I would challenge those numbers. I don't know about it being 45% minority. I have to look at those numbers,
Councilman. We have the numbers to prove it.
You know, we look at the same numbers, man. I never seen that. But what I can say is that if you also look at those numbers, you're talking about 60% white men, but you're also talking about almost 8% Black, 6% Black women, 8% white women. So we're not just talking about diversity in a sense of increasing Black people, but also increase more women, right? We want to see more women in positions of power as well. And I just close with just saying that, you know, it's been an honor just to, you know, have this dialogue, and we got to keep this dialogue. And as the chief said, and as Dr. Dunn just stated, yeah, man, the police officers play a very important role, because that is our beginning into a criminal injustice system. It starts there. It starts with being overcharged, right? It starts with being overcharged in that arrest. And then unfortunately, as it continues, it goes to a judge. And then we live in a city where if the police, in a country, that if a police officer say it, it must be golden. It must be golden. If he said you did it, you must have done it. And this is a problem. This is a problem. But that is just the society that we live in. If you say anything about a police officer, you are anti-police. You are anti-police. And that's the worst thing to be called. If you call anti-police, oh boy, you might as well just hang it all up. So we're not even able to truly hold people accountable. We're not even able to hold them accountable if they do something wrong, because in going against something, now you have this label on you. But hey, not until, as a community, and the police, as the chief said, the community, we must do a better job. No doubt about it. We must do a better job. And guess what? Institutions must do a better job. We got to do a better job in lending to this community. The health institutions, even though we live in a city, we have the healthcare capital of the world, but we still have some of the sickest neighborhoods. We got to address that. We got to address the food desert. So it is a whole issue. It is a whole thing. But the biggest thing I want to leave to everyone out there, and our issue with when it comes to the criminal justice system and the police officers, is that when they do something wrong, we just want you to take care of it. That's all. And show us that you are here to serve us, just like you do every day, Chief. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists. I would love to keep talking, but we are out of time. Thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening to have this discussion and to listen to these questions. I turn it now over to Augie Napoli, the president and CEO of the United Way of Greater Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Nick. Really appreciate your being with us this evening. And I'd also like to say a special thank you to Chief Calvin Williams and Councilman Basheer Jones, Dr. Ronnie Dunn, Lou Katz, and Brian Brian Maxey. We really appreciate you being with us tonight. What an informative conversation. And thanks to our sponsors, Cuyahoga Community College and Rockwell Automation, as well as our many community partners. I want to thank you, our community, for joining us on our mission to create a voice, to encourage engagement, and advance our understanding of the situation and of each other. That's what this is about. It's about conversation. It's about understanding. It's about that. Our next segment will be coming up on March 10th when Colin Cotter, Executive Director of the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, will moderate a discussion on accountability, transparency, and oversight. We will discuss the policies that have been put into place to ensure accountability, what the Cleveland Division of Police has done to improve oversight, and what still needs to be done to increase transparency and build trust with the community. Please join us by registering through our website at unitedwaycleveland.org. And again, thank you for joining us and have a good evening.